Don't study law, Jefferson. Study men.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Trades Tuesday from Colonial Williamsburg. I'm Mark Hutter, Master Tailor in the Department of Historic Trades, broadcasting from the Durfee shop. We thought we'd spend some time this afternoon talking about the collaborative effort of work, both in the 18th century and within the museum today. The expression, "many hands make light the work," is an old one, and just as applicable then as it is now. Of course, it means that by working together we can do more or build things bigger, better, faster. When it comes to clothing, it is always a collaboration. Garments are almost universally made by the efforts of farmers and spinners, weavers, dyers, cloth finishers, long before that cloth ever comes to our hands as tailors or to the hands of the mantua makers and milliners and other clothing-related trades to cut and sew those things. Today within the museum, our work requires the collaborative effort of the Department of Historic Trades, our many colleagues in other trade shops, as well as our curators, conservators, and our Costume Design Center, the facility that is responsible for providing clothing for our staff throughout the historic area. Please join our conversation today. You are welcome to answer questions via the chat there, and we'll answer them as we are able to do so. Let's begin by looking at a few garments, things that we've made here in the tailor shop. When we undertake a project, we most frequently begin by looking at surviving antique garments. Thankfully, we have a very large collection of historic 17th, 18th, and early 19th century clothing here at Colonial Williamsburg, curated by our current Associate Curator of Costume, Neil Hurst. Recently, one project that we undertook in the shop was to reproduce a garment called a set of jumps or a woman's waistcoat. We have a great many of them. Here you see an antique example from our own collection. There are others in collections across the United States and Europe. And yet, remarkably, images of these garments from the 18th century, period depictions, that is, are extraordinarily uncommon. And the written references are scarce. We do have some references to individuals here in Virginia wearing them, particularly enslaved individuals. Those that had attempted to run for their freedom are sometimes described as wearing waistcoats or jumps or jump jackets. So by beginning with the antique object, we made a very careful study of the several that we have in our collection and chose to pattern one. You see us working on a careful pattern here. By then creating an adaptation worn by one of our gardeners, Teal Brooks. We can learn more about these objects through our collaborative efforts than we can from just the extant object or from the written and pictorial descriptions. Teal provides us feedback about how this garment works in her wardrobe, in what layers it may be worn, and provides a sort of insight that is absent from the historic record. Another garment that we have made relatively recently for one of our interpretive staff is this man's waistcoat on the workboard in front of me. This is an undergarment. When worn, it most often would not be seen It's intended to be layered beneath a coat or a jacket or possibly even under a shirt for warmth. That means that the visual descriptions of these garments are extremely uncommon because it's an underlayer. It's invisible or hidden beneath the outer garments. Thankfully, however, there are, again, a few surviving examples. This one is based in part on a surviving English example worn by Lord Horatio Nelson. But we have a very large written record for such garments. Again, descriptions of runaway individuals from plantations here in Virginia occasionally do mention underjackets being worn by enslaved men. In that instance, perhaps being worn even as outer garments because they can be seen by those that are referring to them in those descriptions. But they don't tell us much about the fabrics or the construction. So in this instance, we chose to reconstruct the fabric based on a reference from Mount Vernon. The curatorial staff there provided us a record from Mount Vernon's own weaving house, a weaver's draft, a written set of notation telling the weaver how many yarns to set into the loom per inch to create the fabric, and the notes about the finishing of the cloth allowed us to reconstruct a fabric that no longer exists. This work was done through the efforts of our spinners and weavers here at Colonial Williamsburg, headed by Master Weaver Karen Clancy. The finished fabric then was provided to us as tailors to be cut and fit to one of our staff members. So the jacket was made for Jamar Jones, who portrayed an enslaved man here in the city. Again, this collaboration provides us all with bits of information that in aggregate tell a much broader picture and fuller story than just the written record the surviving object would provide us. I'll make a bit of room on the table here. Perhaps one of the greatest efforts that we've ever undertaken in reproducing a historic garment from our own collection required the work of our staffs within Colonial Williamsburg, including our curators and conservators. But this particular project, I think, is fascinating because it took us abroad. It took us as far as France to find the fabric for this garment. This coat is a reconstruction of an original, which is in our collection. It's the only coat known to survive that we can document as having been worn here in 18th century Williamsburg. Made about 1740, the historic garment was worn by Mr. John Blair, who was the mayor of the city and the presiding member of the governor's council. His fabric, the original fabric, would have been made in England. And to make this reproduction, as I said, we began with a very careful study of the antique object. Unfortunately, that historic coat is extremely fragile, so fragile that it cannot easily be transported and it cannot be exhibited. And so with the help and efforts of our curators and conservators, we created a safe space in our conservation laboratory where the coat could remain and rest while we were working on it. And over the course of several weeks' time, took a very careful series of measures, notes, photographs, and were able to reconstruct the pattern of the garment when new and flat. In aggregate, that work alone of patterning the coat was about 40 hours, plus the time of documentation, which would nearly double that aspect of the project. But then began the work of recreating the textile. If we're going to recreate the coat, we must first begin with the fabric. There are very few firms in the world today that have the technical capability of producing a fabric of this complexity. We turned to a French firm by the name of Tassonnerie et Châtel in Lyon. First working digitally, we provided them photographs and a drawn rendition of the fabric. Their technicians provided us a digital draft, and soon provided us with woven samples so that we could compare these to the historic textile, choosing the one that we felt was the closest, as you see here. They then sent a final sample of yardage for approval, and then we waited for the weaving. From beginning to end, from that first exchange and the technical draft to cloth in hand was a process of nearly 2 years, but well worth the collaboration to finally have a fabric that we could document as having been worn right here in the streets of Williamsburg. We decided to reconstruct the coat in its form when new, about 1740. That required a little bit of detective work because when John Blair Sr. died in 1771, the coat was inherited by his son, his eldest son, John Blair Jr., who quickly had the garment altered. And so we needed to restore the coat to its original appearance. The coats of this particular period are extremely unusual. We have one other garment here at Colonial Williamsburg to which we could compare it and help to fill in some of the missing details. But through the efforts of colleagues in other museums, we located coats of similar age, particularly one at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, that was very similar in cut and construction. And so by studying and patterning the coat in their collection, with the help of their curators, we were then able to rejuvenate and restore the pattern to its 1740s appearance. Our next effort will actually be to also reproduce the coat in its altered state. We'll make another copy of the 1740s suit and then tear it apart to make all the 1770s alterations. Come join us in this coming year as we proceed with that project.
Mark, if you don't mind taking a moment, could you
Absolutely.
unpack for us a little bit what sort of alterations were we talking about in that? Is this about fashion or is it about fit or both?
In this particular case, the garment was altered for its fashion. The 1740s cuff was cut down to a much smaller dimension. The lobe-shaped pocket flap that you can see here was removed and replaced with a peaked style, peaked and scalloped. All of the decorative buttonholes below the waist, here's the less functional buttonhole, but all of these old-fashioned decorative buttonholes were removed for the updated style of the 1770s. And then the coat was cut back on its front edge to a more current line for the new decade as well. This sort of alteration in a garment is very commonplace. The cost of clothing in the 18th century being primarily in the fabrics. Then reusing and remaking clothing is not only good fashion, it's good practice. I think it's also a good example of collaboration, perhaps in a way that we don't often think of it in the 18th century. For this garment to have been used over so many years, it required not only the hands of the first maker, but then the many hands of individuals to maintain, launder the garment through its years of use. So there's sort of the hidden collaboration, especially of enslaved women working in households to maintain clothing, launder clothing, mend clothing. And then, of course, the effort of the second tailor who updated this suit so that it could continue to be worn. In truth, the original coat saw a later alteration as well. We believe that the suit was altered one more time, about 1785, 1789, when John Blair Jr. was inducted as one of the first Associate Supreme Court Justices of the United States. And the suit was, by family legend, worn to that induction. So many hands help working together to maintain garments through years of use.
Mark, that first question, by the way, was from Danielle. Thank you, Danielle. This one from Jackie. Do you think they used the extra fabric from the cuff for the pocket flap?
No. The second pocket flap was made from the first. It was quite obvious that it was cut down from within itself. The little scraps of fabric that were removed from the cuff were too small, certainly, to be used anyplace else. I really believe the cuff was sort of trimmed at the edge, and then the sleeve had to be lengthened, and so the cuff was turned towards the interior to make the sleeve a little bit longer. But there is, I think, a little bit of reuse in the fabric. This long front edge that had been cut off matches in grain the collar band that's on the second phase of the coat. I believe that the new collar was made from the old front edge of the coat. I suppose that's collaboration of a sort, isn't it? Sort of within the garment, the garment reuse, the reuse of the fabric. So, thank you for your questions. Let's look as well at collaboration not only here within Colonial Williamsburg and the efforts of our own Department of Historic Trades, but work that we do outside of Colonial Williamsburg. Many institutions have garments that are incomplete, suits without breeches to them. And they rely on us here within Colonial Williamsburg to help reproduce appropriate garments to complete those ensembles for exhibition. One recent collaboration with the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum and curator Alden O'Brien in Washington, D.C. resulted in this mannequin dressed in pantaloons. The pantaloons are reproductions helping to complete the ensemble. The coat and waistcoat are original. You can see more details of this particular outfit on the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum's website if you were to search for An Agreeable Tyrant. That collaboration led to the study of multiple garments within their collection and the publication of some of them as well. Here is a coat, a homespun coat of about 1805, a very rare surviving example that in and of itself is a good illustration of collaborative effort on a plantation community. This coat, made in South Carolina on the plantation of William Gilbert, was spun and woven by the hands of the enslaved labor, the enslaved community on that plantation. It blends both wool and cotton grown there. Such coats as these are remarkably rare survivors and well worth careful study and documentation. And so in this case, in addition to photographing and exhibiting the coat, we took a complete pattern off of it. And so that pattern, now published in the museum catalog, provides useful information for our colleagues and curators in collections across the United States to help better understand and document objects within their own holdings. Another object from the Museum of the American Revolution, another object that we studied and reproduced from the Museum of the Daughters of the American Revolution is this scarlet cloak for a woman. Such cloaks as these are unusual survivors in southern collections. Northern collections have a number of them. So we sometimes need to turn abroad to our colleagues in other museums to help us better understand garments that are not well represented in our own collections here.
Mark, we do have a handful more questions about the, let's back to the Blair suit. Jean wanted to know about what's the fiber content in the reproduction fabric that you got?
Like the original, it is silk. I will confess that the reproduction fabric, or perhaps better described as an adaptation fabric, is very slightly different from the original. We did modify the weave structure to be able to produce it by a modern jacquard loom. One of the reasons we chose to work with Tassonnier et Chatel is that they were able, if we so desired, to hand weave the fabric. In the end, we opted for that slight modification so that we could produce more of the fabric, thus allowing the two phases of reproduction, the recreating the 1740 and the 1770s appearance, and allowing us enough fabric that as the garment ages and wears through use here in the museum, that we have enough of the fabric to be able to reproduce it again, at least. And so there is that slight modification. But in terms of fiber, color, and overall appearance, it's as close as we possibly could make it.
Owen was curious if there was any noticeable difference between the stitches on the original version and the altered version.
Yes. The care taken in the alterations is not quite as fine as the work in the original construction of the garment. When the suit was made about 1740, it was certainly at the height of fashion and quality. The alterations are done well, but but not with the same precision. I think part of that is simply the awkwardness of working within the finished garment and possibly the required speed to have it done. One thing that we don't know, and I doubt we ever will, is by whom the alterations were made. It's very possible they were done here in the Durfee shop, the shop that we represent within Colonial Williamsburg today. The Blair home is directly across the street from our own shop.
We've heard about this suit in its many lives in the 18th century. Crystal's wondering about what's next. How did it end up coming to the museum? Do we know its history between the 1780s and us having it here at Colonial Williamsburg?
As I had commented, the coat, at least, by family legend, was worn by John Blair Jr. when he was inducted as one of the first Associate Supreme Court Justices of the United States in 1789. The family then saved the coat for generations afterwards, and it passed through the Henderson side of the family and was later donated or actually loaned long-term, I should say, to the Association for the Preservation of Virginian Antiquities and was exhibited in the early 20th century in Richmond, working with the Association for the Preservation of Virginian Antiquities, which I'll now contract to APVA. The coat was later transferred to our holdings here at Colonial Williamsburg and is now a permanent part of our collection.
So we get this thing here, and you mentioned it's very delicate. Tina was wanting to know if there are, how do you handle something like this without damaging it? Besides being very careful and nervous, are there particular rules that you have to follow?
There are, and that's where the help and effort and education of our conservators and curators are such an important part of our collaborative work. In this instance, the best way to handle the antique textile is with freshly washed hands. Any form of glove decreases tactile sensation and can risk further damage to the fiber. But this should always be done under the guidance of a trained conservator. As I had commented as well, we also minimized any effort or any movement of the garment. And so we were very careful to plan our work ahead of time about where in the garment we would be patterning at that moment, isolated that area, and worked in sort of a plot-like manner. So we would pattern one section of the coat, complete as little movement as possible, and then move on to another. And then those various plots were married together to create the final pattern of the garment. So thank you for that question.
Crystal also was a curiosity about, well, can you tell us why they made the buttonholes that way? So I'm not sure what she means by that, but.
I assume what she means is why the buttonholes are overly long, longer than the button itself is. While it is not written in the 18th century, I believe that it is based on the 18th century preference for a very balanced appearance. Fashionable arts, whether architecture, furniture, painting, in the 18th century tend to have a strong preference for symmetry. Dressing the fashionable body begins at a disadvantage because the body is not symmetrical. And so there are a few sort of tricks that we use within clothing to impose that symmetry. One of them is that the buttonhole is elongated to provide a better visual balance for the button. The button itself is round and has mass to it. And if the buttonhole were only the length of the button, then it doesn't have a similar visual mass. And so the buttonhole is elongated generally about 2.5 times the diameter of the button. I suppose returning to our theme of collaboration, it's that collaborative effort between the button and the buttonhole to make the fashionable individual.
So, speaking of, again, collaborations, Betsy was wondering, thinking of the 18th century, would the clothing owner purchase already produced fabric, or could they request a particular pattern be especially woven for them? Does that happen as you did with this fabric? And could you also tell us again the name of the company that produced this fabric for you?
The company today that produced the fabric in Lyon, France, is Tassinare et Chatel. In the 18th century, it is not impossible that one orders bespoke fabric or custom fabric. It's not commonplace, however. Storehouses in this city are filled with cloth that was coming here from all over the world, and so it was very easy to find desired fabrics on the storehouse shelves of Williamsburg. One could also shop abroad in the colonies. But there are individuals here who have direct contact with London and therefore could order fabrics from London merchants and have them sent, or could order fabrics from London weavers and have them sent. It is the fashion amongst the truly elite in London to go to designers like Anna Maria Garthwaite and select a drawn pattern from which their particular fabric would then be woven. To date, I am not aware of any individual in Williamsburg who took advantage of that opportunity or had that opportunity in the 18th century. The truly elite here, for the most part, are ordering finished fabrics from London merchants as opposed to manufacturers.
So they'll bring the fabric to the tailor, and then it'll go from there. Or how often would a tailor have the fabric and to present a few choices for a customer?
The customer who is bringing cloth from England could then bring it to a local tailor or mantua-maker to have the garment made. However, in many instances, they also have the garment made in London. It's much more fashionable, if possible, to have clothing made in London and sent to you. That is one way that local tailors and mantua makers and other individuals know London's fashion. I suppose there's a collaboration within that. They are providing that information in the form of the finished garment. As far as tailors here in the city providing cloth is constantly being imported. It's really difficult to say with what frequency any one shop is receiving fabric. But the largest receipts of fabrics were usually had in the spring and the autumn in preparation for the new fashions. But then it requires a communication, a collaboration between the would-be wearer, the patron, and the tailor. The customer comes to shop to choose the fabric and choose the trims, tell us what it is that they're going to have made. So it's that discussion between the tailor and the wearer as to what the garments will be, the trims, the buttons, etc. And then, of course, the customer must be measured, as everything that we create as tailors is made in our system of measure and pattern, versus the trade of mantua making, where garments are made by taking cloth and arranging it on the wearer. That being the difference between the trades. Not what we make, but how we make it instead. And there are places that tailors and mantua makers either compete or collaborate. There are some garments made by both trades, such as a lady's riding habit could be made by either trade.
A tailor, a mantua maker, London, Williamsburg, Philadelphia, wherever they are. Danielle wants to know, would they sort of build an extra seam allowance to anticipate future alterations?
Sometimes, yes. Garments are constructed with the possible alteration at some time in the future in mind. The side seam of a coat can often have a little bit of extra fabric in it. Perhaps not as much as one might hope, because that then does begin to affect the fit of it. Children's clothing, more than adult clothing, makes that sort of allowance, especially for height as opposed to girth.
So Susie was wondering, in terms of the time it takes to do this work, does it take longer to alter a garment than to just make one from scratch, or is it sometimes it's easier just to make a new thing?
Oh, sometimes alterations take as long or longer than constructing the garment new. especially if it requires any sort of considerable disassembly of the garment. But in the 18th century, the cost of fabric saved is worth the labor of altering, because the fabric is always more than the value of the labor. Even the cheapest workaday clothing, like the underjacket that we discussed earlier, or this pair of linen trousers, again a fabric made by our weavers here. The garments of this workaday nature historically are about 50% value in their goods and 50% value in their making, where something like the Blair suit can easily range upwards of 90 or 95% value in the goods and only 5 or 10% value in the labor. So certainly worth the effort that John Blair Jr. went through, or I should say that the hired hands that John Blair Jr. Paid to remake the garment save the cost of new fabric.
From Christine, she says, the woman's cape appeared to have some gathering in the middle back below the hood. I've not seen that design detail. Could you show it and speak about it a bit?
Sure. So I believe that she was referring to this gathering in the back of the hood. That's actually a very common hood pattern for women's garments in the 18th century. The hood itself is trapezoidal, the long angled edge making the neckline of it. The short straight edge then is partly seamed and then gathered in the back to make the rounded part in the back of the hood. Those gathers, or really radiating pleats, are very regularly set and stitched on the inside to hold their shape as well. The heavier the fabric, the deeper those pleats might be, so they don't become too numerous or too bulky also.
Jumping back to the underjacket, Jean is curious about the fabric there. Is it linen or flannel wool?
The fabric, as documented in the Weaver's Draft Book from Mount Vernon, is a cotton and wool fabric, a union cloth where you have threads of one fiber in one direction and threads of another fiber in the opposite direction. So in this particular fabric, it was a cotton warp, the threads that run the length of the fabric, and a woolen weft, those that run across the fabric. It's difficult to see in the finished cloth because it has been fulled, F-U-L-L-E-D. That's the process of scouring the cloth and raising the nap on it to make a slightly felted finish on the woven base of the cloth. Again, this work is done here by our spinners and weavers in our own workshop. Historically, that would require the work of many different hands and different locations and different trades. At Mount Vernon, as on many of the large plantations of Virginia, the hands of enslaved women and children would tend to the preparation and spinning of the fiber, both wool, cotton, and I should add linen as well. Now, in fact, all four fibers, silk, cotton, wool, and linen, are documented as having been grown and spun here in Virginia in the 18th century. But in this case, the cotton and wool spun by women and children. Weaving on plantations is sometimes the work of enslaved women, although many weavers, both enslaved and free professional, are male. And so the weaver then dresses the loom, weaves the cloth, but off the loom is all the work of finishing. Here in Virginia, there were finishing mills. Jefferson supported the construction of a finishing mill near his home, Monticello, quite late in the 18th century. And so that further trade, yet another step, takes the woven cloth and goes through all the work of scouring, teasing the surface, shearing it, and compacting the cloth, pressing it to make the final product. Each one of those steps is a skill unto its own. Historically, one doesn't work create a piece of cloth from beginning to end. Every object, in this case every piece of fabric, every garment, again, has multiple hands, truly uncountable hands in it. Sometimes, when it comes to the stitching, the cutting and sewing, we can actually see the collaboration. We can see the hands that are working together. The careful analysis of antique garments like the Blair suit often show differences in the way that objects are elements of the object are constructed between the different sides of the body. The pocket flaps or the pocket bags made in two different techniques show us that two different people are working in there. And so though we don't have the opportunity to speak to the historic producers, we can get a sense of their communal effort, their work together, by very carefully studying what remains of their work.
And you mentioned looking at records at Mount Vernon to get a sense of garments for the enslaved community. Jackie asked if there are any of those garments in the Colonial Williamsburg collection.
No, unfortunately. To our current knowledge, there are no garments known to have been worn by any enslaved individual within 18th century America. There are some early 19th century garments. There are some 19th century garments worn by people who had been enslaved in the 18th century but were later emancipated. And so we have to rely very heavily on written and visual descriptions of the clothing of the enslaved in order to reconstruct it. And so the effort of many different scholars, art historians, archaeologists, again work together to better inform and create a much larger picture than any one discipline or any one scholar could produce.
We have time for one final question today. And speaking of collaborations across the board and or across many fields and size, what's the biggest collaborative project you've undertaken?
Undoubtedly, both in physical size and in collaborative effort. Our work with the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia to reproduce George Washington's field tents, a project that was followed by many over the few years that we worked on it. Two tents that each of which are virtually the size of a building required the collaboration of multiple museums and federal entities. It required the work of nearly every trade shop here at Colonial Williamsburg. It required the efforts of an international group of textile scholars to try and identify the manufacture of the original fabric. which we then had reproduced in Northern Ireland, and that alone required several different firms to help with that project. That entire project is a story of its own, one that we'd love to share with you. So join us for a future live stream. Perhaps we'll look at the reconstruction of George Washington's tents.
Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to join us today. And everyone, thank you for joining us and sending in questions. We've had people from all over the world with us today: Sweden, Australia, St. Louis, and Williamsburg. This program, this project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and as always, is made possible through the generosity of our donors. Thank you. To learn how you can contribute to presentations like this, please follow the links pinned to the comments or join us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Thanks once again, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and skills with us. Do you have any final thoughts to send us on our way today?
Well, join us for our next live stream with the blacksmiths on January 11th. Take care.